On the morning of the 21st of January, 1968, North Vietnamese rockets and shells came down on a Marine combat base in the far northwest corner of South Vietnam, and one of the first rounds hit the ammunition dump. The blast tore the dump apart, threw burning shells across the base, and set off secondary explosions that lasted for hours. By the time it was over, the Marines at Khe Sanh had lost most of their ammunition in a single hit, and the long fight that everyone had been bracing for had begun. For the next 77 days, 6,000 U.S. Marines would hold a hilltop base against an estimated 20,000 North Vietnamese troops, sometimes more, ringed in the hills around them. President Johnson, half a world away in Washington, had a sand table model of Khe Sanh built in the basement of the White House and demanded daily briefings. He was so afraid the base might fall that he made his Joint Chiefs of Staff sign a written promise that it would not. And the North Vietnamese general who committed those troops to the siege spent them in a fight that by the end would cost his army somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 dead, against a base the Americans would eventually walk away from on their own. Of all the choices the North Vietnamese made in 1968, choosing to grind 2 divisions to pieces in the hills around Khe Sanh may have been the worst. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This is what happened at Khe Sanh. The base sat on a plateau about 14 miles south of the demilitarized zone that separated North from South Vietnam, and about 6 miles from the border with Laos. That location was the whole reason it existed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the great supply road the North Vietnamese used to move men and material south, ran through the mountains just across the Laotian border. Khe Sanh sat over one of the approaches into South Vietnam from that trail, on the road called Route 9, perched in country full of high jungle hills and clinging mist. Inside the wire on the plateau and on a ring of hilltop outposts around it sat the 26th Marine Regiment under Colonel David Lownds, reinforced by a battalion from the 9th Marines, a battery of South Vietnamese Rangers, and supporting artillery and engineers that make up a combat base. About 6,000 men in total. The hilltop outposts on Hills 861, 881 South, and 558 were not optional. Anyone who held the high ground around the base controlled the artillery lines of sight onto the base itself. And the Marines spent the war's earlier hill fights of 1967 taking those hilltops from the North Vietnamese precisely so that nobody could shoot down onto Khe Sanh from above. What was massing in the jungle beyond the wire was something the Marines had not faced before in this war. By late January, American intelligence was tracking the better part of 2 North Vietnamese divisions, the 304th and the 325C, moving in around the base. They were veteran formations. Both had fought the French at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier, where a French garrison built around the same idea, a fortified base planted in remote country to draw the enemy into a stand-up fight, had been encircled, cut off, and destroyed. That parallel was a thing nobody at any level of the American command could stop thinking about. President Johnson became obsessed with it. He had the sand table model built in the White House Situation Room and stood over it at night, running his hands across the plateau and the hill outposts. He summoned his Joint Chiefs and made them sign a written guarantee that Khe Sanh would not fall. He did not want to be the American president who lost a remote mountain garrison to a communist army, the way the French premier had lost Dien Bien Phu and watched his country's empire in Indochina collapse a few weeks later. General William Westmoreland, the American commander in Vietnam, looked at the same map and saw the opposite of a trap. He saw an opportunity. If the North Vietnamese wanted to throw 2 divisions against a fixed American base, then for the first time in the war, they would be giving him a stationary mass of enemy troops to bomb. He prepared a plan called Operation Niagara, after the waterfall, and the name was deliberate. Niagara would pour every available aircraft in Southeast Asia onto the country around Khe Sanh, day and night. The North Vietnamese plan, whatever its full intent, depended on doing what they had done to the French. Pin the base, cut its supply line, bleed it, starve it, roll up the hill outposts one by one, then assault the runway and the perimeter when the defenders were broken. To do that they needed time, ground, and tunnels, and they began digging exactly the kind of siege works around Khe Sanh that they had dug around Dien Bien Phu, trenches creeping forward to the elephant grass toward the wire night by night. Then the bombing started. The first thing Niagara did was take the mass of the North Vietnamese army and find it from the air. Sensors were dropped along the trails. Reconnaissance planes flew through the mist. Forward air controllers worked the country around the base looking for the things that could not be hidden: the bunker complexes, the artillery positions, the troop concentrations. Once the targets were found, the strikes came down on a scale this war had not seen before. Tactical aircraft flew about 16,000 sorties and dropped roughly 31,000 tons of bombs in the country around Khe Sanh. On top of that, the B-52 arc-light strikes, 3 plane cells of giant bombers dropping their loads from above the clouds, delivered another 60,000 tons. The total weight of explosives dropped in those 77 days, in support of one Marine base, came to more than the entire tonnage of bombs that fell on Japan during 1945. The arc-light strikes were sometimes brought down within 1,000 meters of Marine positions, close enough that the men inside the wire would feel the ground roll under them and watch the jungle along the ridge lines erupt in a long line of fire. A B-52 strike does not look like an explosion to a man standing nearby. It looks like the earth opening up, a strip of ground a mile long lifting straight into the sky at once. The North Vietnamese troops dug into the hills around Khe Sanh were the ones the strikes were landing on. Whole battalions, dug into trenches and bunkers, were buried alive when the cells came over. After the war, captured prisoners and recovered diaries described it in the same terms. Sudden, soundless total. The bombers were too high to be heard before they were felt. While the bombing went on, the Marines on the ground held the base. The single airstrip at Khe Sanh was a lifeline, and the North Vietnamese knew it. They put their guns on it constantly, mortars and rockets and recoilless rifles registered on every inch of the runway, so that any aircraft trying to land was flying into pre-aimed fire. The Marines called the runway the slot machine. You pulled in, and whether you got blown up was pure chance. C-130s landed under fire with engines running, dumped their loads in seconds, and roared out again. When the strip became too dangerous to land on, the bigger transports flew over and parachute-dropped pallets, or skimmed the runway in low passes that yanked the cargo out the back on extraction parachutes without ever touching down. The Marines invented and refined supply techniques in those weeks that would feed every besieged garrison in every war that followed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The men inside those transports lived their own version of the siege. AC-130 crew coming into Khe Sanh would line up on a runway under fire that was already in the air to meet them, touch down through a gauntlet of mortar bursts, hold the brakes long enough for the load to be kicked off the ramp, and roll straight back into the sky. The whole pass might take less than a minute. 130 took a hit to start a fire on board and managed to take off again with the flames still burning. A few were not so lucky and were lost on the strip. Every day, the same flights came in again. The hill outposts had their own war. On the night of the 20th of January, the day before the main siege opened, the North Vietnamese hit Hill 861 in a major ground assault, mortars and rockets, followed by infantry breaking through the wire. The Marines on the hill fought them off in close quarters fighting, and around 2 a.m. the call came down to the nearby Hill 881 South Command bunker. The lieutenant on 861 was screaming into the radio that they were being overrun. They held just the same kind of fight on the same hilltops would repeat through the siege. The worst single blow came on the night of the 6th of February. Just down the road from Khe Sanh, the Special Forces camp at Lang Vay was attacked. The North Vietnamese committed something the Americans had been told to expect, but had still half hoped would not come: tanks. Soviet-built PT-76 light tanks rolled into the Special Forces camp under cover of darkness and overran it. Lang Vay fell in hours. The survivors who could escape made their way to Khe Sanh. The news that the North Vietnamese had armor in this country, that they would and could commit it, sweeping through the base. The Marines waited for the same tanks to come up the road for them. They never did. That fact, as much as anything, is at the heart of what happened at Khe Sanh. The expected great assault on the base never came. There was no Dien Bien Phu moment, no human wave attack across the plateau, no breach of the main wire. The North Vietnamese tried to take the hill outposts and failed. They probed the perimeter. They shelled the runway daily. They dug their trenches closer. But the head-on attack on the combat base that everyone on both sides spent 2 months bracing for did not happen. The bombing is most of the reason. The North Vietnamese divisions massed for the assault were being killed in their assembly areas before they could move. Westmoreland later said flatly that the thing that broke the back of the North Vietnamese army at Khe Sanh was a fire of the B-52s, and the men who survived the trenches on the other side did not disagree. Whole formations were taken apart in the dark by bombs they never saw coming. By early March, the North Vietnamese were already pulling back. The trenches in front of the wire went quiet. The shelling slackened. On the 1st of April, the Americans launched Operation Pegasus, a relief drive up Route 9 from the east by the 1st Cavalry Division and a regiment of Marines, using leapfrogging helicopter assaults to bypass the worst of the road. They reached the base on the 8th of April. The 77 days of siege ended where they had begun, with American Marines still on the hilltop, the runway still in their hands, the perimeter never breached. The cost on both sides was real. American casualties in the 77-day siege were about 274 killed and roughly 2,500 wounded. Marines died in the trenches and in the medevac slots, in the resupply planes coming in over the runway, in the wire on the hill outposts. They paid for the base in life, day after day, for almost 3 months. The North Vietnamese cost was much higher and harder to count. Estimates of NVA killed at Khe Sanh range from about 5,000 to as many as 10 or 15,000, depending on which sources and what period are included. Whatever the exact number, 2 veteran North Vietnamese divisions were ground down in the hills around Khe Sanh to the point that they took years to rebuild. The Marines awarded their Presidential Unit Citation to the 26 Marines for the defense of the base, with Colonel Lownds standing in front of President Johnson on the south lawn of the White House to accept it. By every battlefield measure, the Marines had held. The base did not fall. The hill outposts were not lost. The enemy was bled white in front of the wire and broken by the bombing in the hills. And then, a few months later, the Americans tore the base down. Through the summer of 1968, with the Marines now in pursuit of the broken North Vietnamese divisions across the country around Khe Sanh, the senior commanders looked at the base and decided it had outlived its usefulness. The new American command under General Creighton Abrams, who had taken over from Westmoreland, did not believe in remote fixed bases that tied down whole regiments to defend ground that did not actually matter. In June and July, the engineers came in, the runway was dug up, the bunkers collapsed, and Khe Sanh combat base was abandoned. The hill they had bled for 3 months to hold was given back to the jungle. That is where the title's word mistake lives. Both sides had spent enormously to fight over a piece of ground that, in the end, neither side seemed to want enough to keep. The Americans had held it and walked away. The North Vietnamese had failed to take it and lost a generation of veteran troops in the process. If the goal of a North Vietnamese assault was to seize the base or to draw American forces north away from the cities before the Tet Offensive of late January, then they got, at best, a partial diversion at a catastrophic price. The same divisions that bled themselves at Khe Sanh might have done real damage elsewhere in 1968. Instead, they died in the hills. The Khe Sanh that Lyndon Johnson worried about, the second Dien Bien Phu, never happened. What did happen was the opposite. The French in 1954 had bet on luring an enemy into a stand-up fight and lost a bet when the enemy proved able to put more artillery on the heights than the French could answer. The North Vietnamese in 1968 made the mirror image bet, lured into a stand-up fight by an American base on a plateau, and this time the firepower came down on them. There's a thread that runs through every American fire base fight in that war and lands at Khe Sanh. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong main force units kept attacking dug-in American positions again and again, year after year, hoping to repeat Dien Bien Phu, and each time they were taken apart by the weight of fire the Americans could bring down on a fixed perimeter. Fire Base Gold, Fire Base Burt, Fire Base Illingworth, Coral and Balmoral, Ben Het, every one of them the same story, at a different scale. Khe Sanh was that pattern on its largest and bloodiest scale, the siege that proved, finally at the most terrible cost, that throwing main force divisions head-on into American firepower was a way of killing your own army. A North Vietnamese commander looked at a remote Marine base on a plateau near the Laotian border and saw the chance to reenact the greatest victory of his army's history. He committed 2 veteran divisions to surround it. What he got instead was 77 days under the heaviest bombardment of the entire war, his troops buried alive in trenches by B-52s, his assault on the base never able to launch, and at the end of it, the Marines still on the hill and his divisions broken in the jungle around them. The Americans then walked away from the base on their own terms, and the hill was given back to the country it had been carved out of. Of all the ways the war could have gone for them in 1968, deciding to make Khe Sanh their Dien Bien Phu may have been the costliest decision the North Vietnamese ever made. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.